Hi, I'd like to talk to you about language development. Language development as it pertains to typical children and also to special needs children. Language is something that, is of concern to most parents. They're anxious to hear the first word and the first couplet, the first sentence. For kids with special needs, language is often at the top of the list of concerns. The process of developing language is the same for all children. And it's really important that parents of special needs kids understand that the steps are the same, the pieces are the same. It takes more effort, more work to put those together. We have to be more cognizant of what all those pieces are. But the process is the same. I sadly see therapists around the country working to help children develop their speech and language who don't appear to have a real good understanding of what those pieces are. In other videos, I've talked about input versus output, and often the focus is on output. We're going to try to get the child to repeat this thing endlessly until they can say it, or we're going to try to get the child to repeat this phrase or this sentence endlessly to build the language. That really isn't how you make it happen. You have to understand what the pieces are, and you have to work on those neurodevelopmental pieces to push the language to have that progression occur as it should. Okay, the first major component in putting this together is the brain receiving the information it needs to understand the language receptively. All right, and that begins with hearing, it begins with tonal processing, frequency processing, figure ground processing. These are all important pieces, and you need to understand them. The brain doesn't start off knowing what sound means. The brain doesn't know how to interpret sound. The brain doesn't know how to automatically process frequencies of sound. Your brain learns that through opportunity, through exposure. The first frequencies that appears the brain is most concerned with are higher frequencies and lower frequencies that are kind of environmental sounds. If you will, environmental sounds are those things that keep you alive. All right, you're hearing, that truck coming or that bee that's going to get you. All right, and the brain appears to be very aware of those sounds very early on. Actually, it appears from some of the research that the brain is actually more aware of those sounds than it is of actual visual input. So it reacts actually faster to it. But it has to learn about it. It has to learn to understand it. And we have to get the frequencies coming in, language frequencies, which are kind of the middle range, early on, and with good consistency for the brain to start learning to process those sounds that are the sounds that are part of language. Part of what happens when we delay that development is the brain doesn't learn to focus in on those center frequencies, the language frequencies, as much as it is still attending to the high and low frequencies. This is what produces, distractibility in older kids in the classroom, attention issues in kids in the classroom. That creates a problem we call figure ground hearing, where often the individual is much more aware of the background sounds than the specific sound or the language that we're trying to get them to process. So you're talking to your child, and your child is listening to that airplane up at 30,000 feet. Or the child sitting in the classroom listening to somebody walking down the hallway as opposed to listening to the teacher. But in terms of a young child's development, we want to give them a good quality sound environment. It means we don't want to have too much noise. We don't want to have too much auditory distraction. We want to have nice, clean input. We want to have a lot of language input, a lot of talking to the child to help essentially teach the brain how to process the sound. We also want to make sure that the child's ears are in good shape, that the ears are clear, that we don't have fluid problems. If your child has congestion, you probably have fluid in the middle ear. It's a good idea to get tympanograms and find out what actually is going on, make sure those ears are clear. So we want to make sure that we get that input, all right? And then we need to make sure we continue to develop the tonal processing, figure ground processing. If we have frequency problems, essentially your brain is put in a position where it's having to interpret what you hear. It's trying to fill in the gaps and figure it out, which makes then sequential processing much more difficult. Sequential processing is how many pieces of auditory information can you take in a sequence. If you listen to little kids when they start talking, you're often just hearing the first sound of the word. They're not putting all the pieces together because they can't sequentially process all the pieces. As we develop the sequential processing, we're then permitting the child to understand, hear more of the pieces, and then start replicating more of the pieces. To put that part in perspective, a child who can process a 1, and you could call that the equivalent of a digit span of 1, all right? The child who can process 1, you get the first random words coming out. That is our general expectation. So that child at a 1, you get a couple words popping out. When the child can sequentially process 2 pieces, we start getting functional language where the words have intention. The child pulls out that word when the child needs that word. And we also start getting, as we progress through the 2s, to the child using couplets, putting 2 words together, and initial 3 words together. A piece that's kind of significant here is, we talk about sequential processing in terms of pieces. Can a child process 1 piece, 2 pieces, 3, so forth, or equate that to digit spans. But in truth, what our research is showing, it's not whether or not you're a 1 or a 2 or a 3, it's are you a 2.0, a 2.1, a 2.2, a 2.3, a 2.4, up to a 3. And all those very small incremental changes produce changes in function. So relative to language development, the child going from that 2 to a 3 is going to be moving that child from saying single words to couplets to initial 3-word phrases. When we get up into the ranges of the 3s, we start getting 3 words, 4 words, and very initial 5 words out of the child. All right, then as we start getting up into 4s, we get initial kind of conversational language. Even starting in 5, conversational language is pretty solid. So to get the output, to get the function, we have to have the processing. We have to have the power, if you will, the brain power, if you will, to produce it. So if we're trying to get a child who's only saying single words to say couplets, the primary thing we have to do is improve their processing. If we're trying to get a child who's saying couplets and get them using 3 and 4 word phrases, primary thing is processing. All right, it's not having them say the sentence over and over again. And relative to the speech component, language is what you say, speech is how well you articulate it. All right, the oral motor aspects of the speech and replication of what you hear. Often the problem with the speech is the child is just replicating what they hear. So if they have tonal processing problems, that often is going to produce articulation problems. Relative to the articulation problems, again, it tends to be developmental. One of the important issues is simply the child's eating. If you will, the first real speech therapy that a child does is learning how to move food in their mouth and chew. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but I tell you, for our special needs kids, if I see a child who's 5 years old and still eating pureed foods, we know we have a child with probably horrendous oral motor function. All right, if the child can't chew, that child can't move their tongue, they can't control the tongue, they can't control the mouth, they're not controlling the breathing. All those factors that spell having an oral motor problem are developmental, and often, what they were fed, how they were fed was a significant component of that. So for all your kids, chewing is actually a big issue, and developing oral motor function. So if we have a speech problem, generally it's either the child's not being able to hear the sounds correctly, so they can't replicate them correctly, or the child has a problem in terms of the oral motor function in producing those sounds, or the child has a sequential processing problem and can't put those sounds together in a sequence to form an entire word or to articulate, a full sentence well. Can't hold together enough pieces to do that. So the basic components to develop language for kids is to make sure that they can hear well, all right, process the frequencies, process the sounds well, that we develop sequential processing, and we also develop all the oral motor functions that permit them to then articulate it. If we want to develop language and we want to develop speech, you have to address all those pieces. If you do not address all those pieces, if there's problems with any of those pieces, you are not going to produce the speech and language that you want. Okay? So, you got to put together all the pieces. You have to be mindful of all the pieces if you're going to be successful. Okay? Thank you.